The Cold War was a period of intense political and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting from the end of World War I in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was a time of fear, suspicion, and hostility as both superpowers engaged in a global struggle for power and influence. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the end of World War I, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant powers in the world. Despite the shared victory over Nazi Germany, the two countries had very different political and economic systems, and the leaders had very different visions for the post-war world. The United States was a capitalist democracy committed to free markets, individual rights, and the spread of democracy around the world. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was a communist state committed to the principles of socialism, collective ownership, and the spread of communism around the world. These fundamental differences in ideology and worldview set the stage for the Cold War as the two superpowers jockeyed for position and influence in a world that was increasingly divided along ideological lines. Over the next several decades, the Cold War would shape the course of world history as the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a series of proxy wars, arms races, and diplomatic maneuvers that would have far-reaching consequences for the world as we know today. The early years of the Cold War were marked by a series of crises and conflicts that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. One of the first major crises of the Cold War was the Berlin blockade, which began in 1948 when the Soviet Union cut off all land and water access to the city of Berlin, which was located deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. The United States responded by launching a massive airlift operation, firing in supplies and food to the beleaguered city for nearly a year. The Berlin airlift was a major victory for the United States, demonstrating its commitment to its allies and its willingness to stand up to Soviet aggression. Another major crisis of the early Cold War was the Korean War, which began in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States and its allies intervened on behalf of South Korea, while the Soviet Union and China supported North Korea. The war lasted for 3 years and resulted in the division of Korea into two separate countries that remain divided to this day. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to nuclear war over the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. After a tense standoff, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US promise not to invade Cuba and the removal of US missiles from Turkey. Throughout the early years of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, building up their nuclear arsenals and developing new weapons and technologies to gain an edge over their rival. This arms race would continue for decades, driving both countries to the brink of financial ruin and creating a constant sense of fear and anxiety among the world's population. In the 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union began to realize the dangers of the ongoing arms race and the need for a more stable and peaceful relationship. This led to a period of detente, or relaxation of tensions, between the two superpowers. One of the key moments of detente was the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty SALT in 1972, which placed limits on the number of nuclear weapons each country could possess. This was followed by the signing of the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which established a framework for cooperation and human rights in Europe. Despite these efforts at detente, the Cold War continued to simmer, with both sides engaging in proxy wars and supporting opposing sides in conflicts around the world. However, the end of the Cold War would come unexpectedly and quickly in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Soviet Union, facing economic and political turmoil, began to collapse from within. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had been a symbol of the Cold War for decades, was torn down, signaling the end of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, ending the Cold War and leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. The end of the Cold War had far-reaching consequences for the world, as it ushered in a new era of globalization and cooperation. However, it also created new challenges and threats, such as terrorism and the rise of new powers like China. Today, the legacy of the Cold War continues to shape the world, as the United States and Russia continue to engage in a complex and often contentious relationship. However, the lessons of the Cold War have also taught us the importance of diplomacy, cooperation, and the need to work together to address the challenges of the 21st century. The legacy of the Cold War is complex and multifaceted, with both positive and negative consequences for the world. On the one hand, the Cold War helped to prevent a global conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, which could have had catastrophic consequences for the world. The Cold War also spurred technological innovation and scientific advancement, as both the United States and the Soviet Union poured resources into the military and space programs. This led to the development of new technologies and breakthroughs in fields like medicine, communications, and transportation. However, the Cold War also had many negative consequences, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the ongoing threat of nuclear war. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union also had a devastating impact on the global economy, as both countries poured vast resources into their military programs at the expense of social welfare and economic development. The Cold War also had a profound impact on international relations, as it created a deep sense of mistrust and suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as between the two blocs of countries aligned with each superpower. This legacy of mistrust and suspicion continues to shape international relations today, as countries around the world struggle to find common ground and work together to address global challenges. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Cold War has also taught us the importance of diplomacy, cooperation, and the need to work together to address the challenges of the 21st century. As we move forward, it is important to remember the lessons of the Cold War and to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous world for all. The Cold War was a defining period in world history, shaping the course of international relations and global politics for decades. It was a time of fear, suspicion, and hostility as the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a global struggle for power and influence. Despite the many challenges and dangers of the Cold War, it also taught us important lessons about the importance of diplomacy, cooperation, and the need to work together to address global challenges. Today, as we face new threats and challenges, it is more important than ever to remember these lessons and to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous world for all. The legacy of the Cold War continues to shape the world today, as countries around the world grapple with the ongoing challenges of nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and economic inequality. However, it is also a reminder of the resilience and strength of the human spirit and the power of cooperation and collaboration to overcome even the most daunting challenges. As we look to the future, it is important to remember the lessons of the Cold War and to work towards a world that is more peaceful, more just, and more prosperous for all. By working together and embracing the values of diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual respect, we can build a better world for ourselves and for future generations.